Not a lot of bank robberies attract a crowd of well-wishers. But I was a popular guy, and I was good at what I did.
Hometown crowd cheers for Pretty Boy Floyd as he raids the local bank, a criminal with a fan club.
It became almost a matter of pride to claim that any two-bit robbery had in fact been carried out by Pretty Boy Floyd.
I'm Melvin Purvis of the FBI, and I ain't no fan of Floyd. After the massacre at Union Station, his days are numbered in single digits.
The Kansas City massacre changed everything for Pretty Boy Floyd. He became a hunted criminal.
Their fellow agents stop at nothing to bring the killers to justice.
They're gonna frame me for Kansas City? Oh, I'm not gonna take that lying down. They call me Pretty Boy, but when you have 200 agents chasing you down, things are gonna get ugly.
Pretty Boy Floyd handled his robberies with a precision that was virtually unmatched. There was only one bank robber of the time that robbed more banks more successfully than Pretty Boy Floyd, and that was John Dillinger.
Floyd became a bit of a hero just because in the world of us and them, he was us and the banks were them.
It was November of '32, and I was on my way home to Oklahoma to do what I do best.
The Sallisaw bank robbery in the annals of Pretty Boy Floyd has the distinction of Floyd having invited his friends and relatives over to watch the bank robbery.
Charles Arthur Floyd came into town at about 10 o'clock. His partner, George Birdwell, who he called Bird, was also in the car. They pulled up right in front of the bank. They got out of the car, and then Charles began to greet his friends and neighbors. He'd specifically invited his own grandfather, Charles Murphy Floyd, and told his grandfather where it would be best to sit. And someone asked him, "What are you here for today, Charlie?" And he said, "I'm here to rob the bank."
Pretty Boy knows everybody in town. He actually goes next door to the barber shop, and he says hello to the barber, and one of the customers there, and he says, "Now, don't pick up that telephone and make any phone calls here, because I'm going to go on into this bank. We're going to rob this bank." The barber says, "Hey, don't worry about it. We're not going to make any phone calls."
He went in and told the bank teller, "Give it all to me, and we'll be out of your hair."
It was kind of like a successful actor returning to his hometown after having made it big on Broadway. He got great delight out of just being able to go into his hometown and rob that bank and get away scot-clean. As a matter of fact, the sheriff who knew Pretty Boy Floyd, he didn't know about it for 20 minutes or so that the bank had been robbed. And by that time, Pretty Boy Floyd and his accomplices were long gone.
And guess what? Not a single person rats me out to the cops. Ain't no love lost for the banks where I grew up.
It's one thing to be a bank robber. It's quite another thing to be a bank robber in Oklahoma in the Dust Bowl years in 1932.
But people stayed and prayed in the Dust Bowl. Of course, praying for rain and always looking forward to next year. Always looking for next year. I guess this is the greatest next year country on the face of the earth.
People today have no clue how bad the Depression really was. How, 2 out of 5 Americans were out of work. You've heard the term the Dust Bowl. That means literally farms where the dirt just dried up and blew away. Half the state of Oklahoma got thrown off its farms. Banks foreclosed on everything.
There was animosity against the banks, particularly among the people who were facing foreclosure.
So Floyd was greeted as this kind of Robin Hood-like figure by ordinary Oklahomans.
They loved him. That would be the short way to say it. They loved him. He was doing things that many of them did not have the courage or had too much honesty to do.
Just doing what comes natural. Been dodging trouble since I was knee-high to a grasshopper.
Charles Arthur Floyd moved at a very early age to Sallisaw, Oklahoma, to work on the farm that his father owned.
It was about as backwards and undeveloped as America got. You know, it was hard to find a job, and in time, like a lot of his peers, probably too many of his peers, he fell into a life of petty crime.
I wouldn't call it petty, just small. I was a kid after all.
He and a couple buddies jimmied open the window of a store that was also a post office, and they stole a whole bunch of pennies.
$350 in pennies, worth $5,000 today. And that was the first time that he got into the observation of the authorities.
He could have gotten into some serious trouble because it's a United States post office, which would have made it a federal crime. But his father, Walter Floyd, stood up for him and said that there was no way he did it because he was at home in bed at the time.
God bless the old man for that. But I had a calling, and it wasn't the family business.
One thing that Pretty Boy Floyd learned early was he was not going to be a cotton farmer. He wanted to find something somewhere else, and so he looked to the cities.
I land in St. Louis at 21. I'm starting to realize I'm in way over my head.
Pretty Boy Floyd's first really big crime was when he and a couple of his companions hold up a Kroger grocery store payroll and steal about $11,000, which of course in 1925 is quite a large sum of money.
I was a wealthy man, rich for about 3 minutes.
And they attract the attention of the local gendarme, so they pulled them over and they started questioning them, and they found that they had payroll money that still had the bank wrapping name around the money.
They get arrested, and he ends up in the state pen in Missouri for 5 years.
The Missouri penitentiary was probably among the worst in the United States in the sense that they literally would attach a ball and chain to the convicts' ankles.
The only bright prospect for someone like Charles Arthur Pretty Boy Floyd was the educational opportunities it presented. For him, it was an opportunity to learn about the higher levels of crime.
How you would case a bank, how you would crack a safe, how you would get away from the scene of a crime. That was his finishing school, so that by the time he gets out of the Missouri State Penitentiary in 1929, he is now pretty much a hardened criminal.
And from the Missouri State Pen, I know exactly where I'm headed.
Everyone in the Jefferson City prison that he respected, all of the high-level criminals told him that Kansas City was a place that he had to go.
My kind of town. I felt right at home.
Kansas City had a nice gentleman's agreement.
There was basically a deal between the Kansas City mob and the Kansas City political infrastructure that the mob would keep major crime down so as to be allowed to conduct their pettier crime, things like gambling and prostitution and bootlegging and booze manufacturing and things like that.
It was a nice back-scratching operation. So Kansas City was a great place to come for R&R, and a lot of them did.
Kansas City's also where I get my new name.
One day he walked into a boarding house run for the benefit of criminals like him, and a beautiful willowy woman named Beulah Ash walked in, sat down next to him, handed him a beer, and asked him one question. "Where did you come from, Pretty Boy?" And that was the beginning of his career as Pretty Boy Floyd.
But it takes more than a good nickname to make it. I got an ace in my pocket. And that's what we call a Chicago typewriter.
Nobody in their right mind wanted to confront a man with a machine gun. And law enforcement, especially in these small towns, were very happy to stop at the state line or to even look the other way.
The local law can't touch me. And I ain't worried about a bunch of suits they're calling Bureau of something or other.
I guess he's talking about us. I'm Melvin Purvis of the Bureau of Investigation. One of J. Edgar Hoover's boys.
Melvin Purvis was one of his leading agents. He was a young man from North Carolina that had gone to law school and saw the FBI as a way to progress in his career.
They always referred to him within the Bureau as Little Mel. Mel was very short, but he was very bright, and he was a good agent.
The public needed another kind of hero, of someone on the other side, and my father provided that.
We're just trying to make the country a little safer. But back then, the Bureau was just starting out.
The FBI was little more than process servers for the federal prosecutors. There was no national law enforcement. There was no national police force in America.
At that point in time, the FBI really was nothing more than kind of a backwater division of the Department of Justice.
They didn't have the authority to arrest anybody. They couldn't serve warrants. They couldn't carry guns.
Meaning us bank robbers are going hog wild.
Hoover was very aware of his activities, but Charles Arthur Floyd was by no means at the top of the list.
That's, Charles Pretty Boy Floyd to you. And I'm about to take the Southwest for all it's worth.
Just my opinion, but I don't think he's all that pretty. Turned out, he wasn't all that clever either.
My first stop is the Sylvania Bank in Ohio. I thought the bank would be taken off guard, but as it turns out, we were. We were supposed to get in, get out, and get away. It's not long until local deputies catch up with my crew, and they get into a damn shootout. And one of the coppers goes down, shot dead. And my knucklehead colleagues lead the cops directly to the safe house where I'm holed up counting the cash. I just gotta choose my friends more carefully, it's all. I avoided getting done for murder, but had to cop to robbery.
After his arrest in Ohio, Floyd is put on a train to go to jail.
If I know one thing, is that I wasn't put on this earth to serve time. I was put here to rebel, to rob, to kidnap, to kill. I was a class act. Petty crook turned bank robber turned Oklahoma hero. The people loved Pretty Boy Floyd, but the officers of the law not so much. After we got nailed by the cops for robbing a bank in Ohio, I pled guilty to robbery. It earned me a first-class ticket back to the penitentiary, but I had other plans.
Pretty Boy noticed that the police officers who were supposed to be guarding him not only left the compartment, they also left the train car in which they were riding to go to another car.
He made a dash for the bathroom, and he opened up the window and just flung himself out of the window of a moving train.
I'm lying there bruised, bloodied, but alive.
They stopped the train, and instead of running, Pretty Boy Floyd hid in the brush, and he just remained stealthily quiet.
And I'll be damned if it didn't walk right past me.
And they were not able to find him. And so eventually he watched the train go away into the distance, and then he walked on into Youngstown, Ohio.
One thing about Floyd is that he was very elusive. I mean, he knew how to slip between the cracks.
It was a very desperate escape, but it really showed that he had no intention whatsoever ever going back to a penitentiary once again. He was not going to serve time in a pen.
Floyd was already a wanted man. Now, he was a national target. But instead of laying low, he decides to up the ante, and his reputation spreads.
It's as if Oklahoma was just thirsting for a name brand outlaw of its own. Almost every time a bank got hit, people were saying Pretty Boy Floyd did it. Maybe he hit 3 or 4 banks that year.
Pretty Boy Floyd robbed at least 16 banks and probably more.
Somewhere between 30 and 60 banks at least.
It became almost a matter of pride to claim that any 2-bit robbery that had occurred in your bank had in fact been carried out by Pretty Boy Floyd.
No, I've honestly lost track, but of this I'm sure. I'm making my mark.
There's a wonderful story that goes around that Pretty Boy Floyd burned mortgages when he robbed banks.
This made them really heroes in the eyes of a lot of people.
We don't know whether the people whose mortgages were destroyed by Pretty Boy Floyd were able to actually escape paying off those mortgages, but it makes a great story.
All this adoration sets my teeth on edge. The trail of blood Floyd leaves behind isn't so pretty.
Pretty Boy Floyd was not a psychopathic killer. He did not seek to kill people. He did not enjoy or take pleasure out of killing people. But nevertheless, he gunned down a lawman in Ohio. He gunned down a lawman in Oklahoma.
Pretty Boy Floyd certainly was involved in as many as 3 to 4 killings without question.
Spring of 1933 is the first time I pick up my new partner, 23-year-old Adam Ricchetti.
Floyd needed a second lieutenant, so to speak, to accompany him.
Ricchetti knew how to handle himself and a gun. The trouble was he had, well, let's just say, certain predilections.
What we know most about Adam Ricchetti is he could draw very well, and he was a drunk. And he would drink moonshine from like 8 in the morning until he passed out at 3 and then start drinking again.
Floyd sometimes had to tone Ricchetti down because Ricchetti it was very unstable in every conceivable fashion.
So here's me and Ricchetti in Bolivar, Missouri, getting some work done on our latest set of wheels.
Pretty Boy Floyd and Adam Ricchetti were at the Bitzer car dealership in Bolivar when all of a sudden the local sheriff strolled in, aimlessly.
Sheriff Killenworth, his name was.
He wasn't looking for Floyd. He didn't know Floyd was within a mile, 10 miles, or 100 miles. He just came in to chat with the guys.
Ricchetti's already half blotto, and I don't like it. Not one bit.
And Adam Ricchetti, who was drunk at 7 o'clock in the morning, saw the sheriff and said, "He's the law," and wanted to kill him.
And he pulls out a gun, and he's about to shoot him, and Floyd says, no, stop.
Damn, Ricchetti almost drilled him. So nothing for it but to toss Sheriff Killenworth in the car and get the hell out.
Now, Pretty Boy Floyd was not in the business of kidnapping.
He thought it might give him a little bit of a shield if people did come after him.
I also need the sheriff to guide me out of town because I don't know Bolivar from a hole in the ground.
He needed somebody sober who could help him get to Kansas City where he knew he could find refuge.
Basically, they spent the day with him. And according to Sheriff Jack Killingsworth, he was able to have extended conversation with Pretty Boy Floyd, and he shared his thinking with Jack Killingsworth along the way. And he basically said, I don't want to go back to prison, and so I know that this isn't going to end very well.
By that night, Pretty Boy Floyd and Adam Ricchetti are able to release the sheriff on the outskirts of Kansas City, and they head on into town.
We got away with it. But I had no idea we were driving into a snake pit.
He drove down into what we call the West Bottoms in Kansas City. It was a strip of brothels and bars and very little else, and all run by the mob.
He wasn't the only one headed to Kansas City that day. A couple of my fellow federal agents were escorting a prisoner there, a vile miscreant by the name of Frank Nash.
Frank Nash, sometimes known as Jelly Nash, was a well-connected bank robber in the 20s and 30s, worked with the Barker Gang, worked with a lot of gangs.
While Nash is being escorted to Leavenworth Pen, Floyd apparently pays a visit to another low-life ratfink, name of Vern Miller.
Vern Miller was a disgraced South Dakota lawman who had gone into bank robbing and being a hitman, in essence, for the Chicago, New Jersey, and Detroit mobs. And he and Frank Nash were best friends.
Vern at least is loyal, his only redeeming quality. He sets a plan in motion to rescue his buddy Frank. So he turns to the local mob boss, the guy who runs Kansas City, Johnny Lazia.
The FBI's version is that Vern Miller ended up going to Johnny Lazia and said, I need help to do this rescue of Frank Nash. And Lazia allegedly said, no, you can't have any of my people, but I know this guy who's in town, Pretty Boy Floyd.
I ain't no friend of Frank, but if there's a payout, maybe I'd think about it.
And I think that Vern Miller looked him up and said, I need help with a little thing. There's good money in it. I'll pay you. It should be easy.
7 lawmen escorting Nash is what Vern calls easy. I'd hate to see his version of difficult.
Frank Jelly Nash arrived in Kansas City on a Missouri Pacific train at 7:15 a.m.
The 7 lawmen take Nash out to waiting cars where they will drive him the hour or so up to Leavenworth.
Nash was supposed to be in the back seat, but they told Nash, no, you sit in the front seat so we can keep an eye on you.
So you've got 3 lawmen in the back seat, and you've got Jelly Nash in the front seat now.
Too bad all those people didn't see that car for what it really was. A coffin. Pretty Boy Floyd is on the lam and has just arrived in Kansas City. On the very next day, a bunch of unidentified gunmen ambushed bank robber Frank Nash and 7 lawmen outside Union Station.
You want to make a name for yourself? Oh. This is one way to get noticed.
And all of a sudden, these people appeared, and they said, up, 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 get your arms up.
And that's when all hell broke loose.
With no further warning, someone opens fire, and the car is raked by machine gun fire. Frank Nash's head explodes. Another FBI agent is killed.
Agent Lackey and Agent Smith, the 2 that were sitting in the back seat, were able to survive by ducking underneath the front seat.
And by the time it's all over, 4 lawmen were dead, as well as Frank Nash. And the perpetrators sped off into history.
And that's the Kansas City Massacre.
3 police officers killed, 1 federal agent dead, and another wounded. A crucial moment for the agency. And for my boss, J. Edgar.
The fallout from the Kansas City Massacre is enormous. It forces J. Edgar Hoover, who has never confronted anything remotely like this, the killing of multiple lawmen, including FBI agent. It's suddenly he is going to have to solve a major crime, something, in essence, that the FBI has never done to that point.
And there was another huge factor, too, Hoover's own pride. An FBI agent had been killed in the line of duty.
He could not let this go unanswered.
So he immediately stood up and said, give me the tools, and I'll clean up this mess.
J. Edgar Hoover was a master of taking a disaster and turning it into an opportunity.
What it means is that resources are funneled to the FBI. They are given the powers to make arrests. They are given guns.
There is nothing mysterious about the manner in which the Federal Bureau of Investigation works. A special agent must be a good marksman and have the courage to shoot it out with the most venomous of public enemies.
And the very first thing they have to do is find out who did the Kansas City Massacre. That's the job in front of them. In the hours and days after the Kansas City Massacre, the FBI has not a clue who did this. I've seen the suspect lists. Bonnie and Clyde are on it. The Barker gang is on it. Basically, any bank robber that was still out there robbing banks was on it.
And me? Yup, I was on that damn list as well. The feds basically shake every tree in town looking for leads. And after they rattle a few gangsters, my name falls out.
Pretty Boy Floyd learned that he was a suspect in the massacre simply by reading the paper the next day. They knew that he was in town, and so that's part of the reason he was immediately looked at, along with his partner of the time, Adam Richetti.
The Kansas City Massacre changed everything for Pretty Boy Floyd. He became a hunted criminal. He had to hide. He couldn't be out in the open ever again.
Once Hoover and the Bureau had focused on Pretty Boy Floyd and Adam Richetti and decided they had to be the ones, the pressure to find Floyd and Richetti was enormous.
Pretty Boy Floyd had every reason to fear the FBI.
I gotta get the word out. Pretty Boy's been framed. So I take out my pen and get to work.
Within a matter of a couple of weeks, a letter showed up in which he disclaims any participation in the massacre at Kansas City, and he signs it Charles Floyd. He was trying to basically conduct a public relations campaign by saying, I didn't have anything to do with it. But frankly, that just didn't pan out.
Charles Arthur Floyd really did not have an alibi that would hold up for the massacre.
The cops don't believe him. I don't believe him. Most important, Hoover doesn't believe him.
With the heat closing in, Ricchetti and me, we hightailed it out of KC like our lives depended on it. Because, well, they did.
Pretty Boy Floyd knew that he was not going to escape this life of crime and be able to retire from it in some type of ordinary fashion.
Ricchetti felt the same way. They weren't going to go back to jail, and if that meant killing someone, then that's certainly they would have done that.
We went all over looking for a place to hide. Cleveland, LA, Oklahoma City, Akron, but all we get are shut doors.
And with me and the FBI on his tail, the temperature's rising daily.
It's not just the good guys who are out for blood. It's the bad guys, too. When I found out what happened to Vern Miller, the so-called brains behind the massacre, the electric chair would have been merciful.
He had his forehead bashed in with what they presume was a claw hammer. He was tortured. He was bound. You know, what he did in Kansas City was perceived as being unforgivable within the underworld because you don't kill cops.
We all suspected Pretty Boy had a hand in the Kansas City massacre. Proving it, however, that's something else.
Director Hoover supervising field practice.
Within a year, the FBI was a formidable force. They were suddenly able to carry guns, able to make arrests, able to cross state lines. The problem was that Hoover's investigation of the massacre was going nowhere. Nowhere.
After the massacre, onlookers and curiosity seekers just thronged around the automobiles and basically ruined the crime scene, so that from a forensic perspective, very difficult to piece together what went down. The versions of events that people gave, now these are people that actually saw it happen, or at least they claim to have seen it happen, they were markedly different. There were so many inconsistencies.
One volunteer with the Travelers Association identified someone who looked somewhat like Pretty Boy Floyd, yet the person she described was 200 pounds in weight, and Pretty Boy Floyd was only 160 pounds.
The lawmen who survived the Union Station massacre said, I saw nothing, I can't identify anybody.
Still, the smart money is on Floyd. We had a witness say that Floyd took a bullet in the shoulder, and if we can ever lay our hands on him, he'll still have the scar. Luckily, when we scour Vern Miller's apartment for evidence, we find something else that's pretty damning.
It took about 6 months before anybody got around to checking the fingerprints that had been taken from Vern Miller's house.
They found a beer bottle, and they were able to take the fingerprint off of that beer bottle and match it to Adam Ricchetti.
If Adam Ricchetti was there, Floyd was there. If Floyd and Ricchetti were at Vern Miller's house and Vern Miller did the massacre, then they had to be the two that did it. That was Hoover's logic.
If one fingerprint on a beer bottle makes me a public enemy, well, logic be damned. Purvis and his G-men think they're pretty clever. The only shot I got is to be smarter, faster, and quicker on the draw.
Pretty Boy Floyd is not only wanted for bank robbery and escape, he's now the prime suspect in the Kansas City massacre. We were convinced of that after Adam Ricchetti's fingerprint was found on a beer bottle at Vern Miller's place.
It was kind of guilt by association that Pretty Boy Floyd was always with Ricchetti, so the evidence is more or less circumstantial.
Circumstantial nothing. The Bureau might be confident that I'm their man, but it's a setup.
The idea of collecting fingerprints was a hit and miss sort of thing. They didn't have any experts who knew exactly how to do that. Their brand new crime lab in the beginning amounted to nothing more than a lot of ambition and a microscope. I have come to the conclusion that it somehow or other was faked. It was not actually Ricchetti's print.
Hoover needed us so badly to have Floyd as a target, that perhaps he made it happen in his mind.
And in Hoover's mind, me and Vern, best of pals. Guilt by association.
Pretty Boy Floyd didn't know Vern Miller from a box of salt. They weren't friends. They'd never done anything together.
They had no criminal association with each other. They had no past with each other.
Pretty Boy Floyd wasn't in the habit of doing favors for people. He wasn't the kind of guy who would take his machine gun and say, sure, I'll help you rescue your friend. He didn't know Jelly Nash from anybody.
And clearly Floyd and Ricchetti, having kidnapped the sheriff from Bolivar the day before, they were just on the run. They hadn't had any grand design about what they were going to do when they got to Kansas City.
Now you get the divergence in what really happened.
Most of them concerning the question of who shot first. Apparently, the Bureau agents sitting directly behind Nash had never used that particular shotgun before.
Joe Lackey had a Model 12 Winchester, and if you know anything about guns, it's very complicated, but if you hold the trigger back and pump the action, it will fire like a machine gun. Boom, 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 boom.
So one theory is Lackey fumbles around with that shotgun and bang, blows the top of Frank Nash's head clean off.
Ray Caffrey, the FBI agent, was walking around to the front of his car, and one of those ball bearings from that shotgun went right into Agent Caffrey's head.
But it ain't over yet.
Then Joe Lackey, still trying to figure out how the devil this gun worked, took off the head of Frank Hermanson. That's 3 people dead, and nobody has fired yet except Joe Lackey, who is the FBI's own man in the backseat.
And that's when Vern and his buddies start shooting back.
Ray Hermanson, the local policeman, was hit twice with a machine gun in his chest.
The sheriff escorting Nash to Leavenworth gets his in the crossfire.
Of the 5 people who died that morning, 4 of them had fatal friendly fire wounds.
J. Edgar Hoover did a very good job for many years of quelling what actually went down at the Union Station massacre in terms of who shot first and who shot whom.
The truth is, Hoover settles on me as the trigger man from day one, whether I'd done it or not.
With Hoover's reputation on the line, we had to close this case, and fast.
Members of Congress who did not like Hoover, a lot of them were looking for an excuse to get rid of Hoover.
The FBI had everything to gain by successfully closing the Kansas City massacre case. They could not close this case. Their newly acquired power and authority might have been in danger.
Back in Chicago, I'm using that power to catch John Dillinger, public enemy number 1.
Public enemy now rises to fame as an underworld hero. Arrogant, that expression in his eyes.
But if there's a number 1, you know there's a number 2, and 3.
Floyd was always on the FBI list in Chicago, and my father being head of the Chicago office, he was always after him, but he also had no trace of him.
That's because me and my partner are hiding out in Buffalo. Sharing a flea-ridden dump with a drunk like Ricchetti ain't my idea of a good time. But at least I got my girl Beulah to keep me company.
They don't go anywhere. They don't do anything. They hardly talk to anybody.
He and Ricchetti would go out every once in a while just to do a little job somewhere to keep enough money to pay the rent.
Wild excitement. Dillinger killed by federal agents assisted by East Chicago, Indiana police.
After months of hunting, we finally killed Dillinger, and the Bureau is riding high.
It was really the Dillinger kill in July of 1934 that made Purvis' reputation.
With Dillinger gone, I now have another public enemy to attend to.
During the year in Buffalo, Pretty Boy Floyd did the 2 things that he liked doing most. He played lots of cards, and he baked lots of apple pies.
The people that lived below in the apartment where Pretty Boy Floyd and Adam Ricchetti were living, they could hear him pacing all the time, pacing back and forth like a caged panther.
Pretty Boy Floyd and Adam Ricchetti hated being cooped up like that. They just couldn't stand to be cooped up anymore.
He saw a headline in some newspaper where he was public enemy number 1. Dillinger kind of liked it, but Floyd thought it made him more of a target.
If I'm gonna be a target, I'm more than determined to be a moving one.
Pretty Boy Floyd and Adam Ricchetti decided to leave Buffalo, where they'd been for at least a year. It may have been that they were homesick. It may have been that they were going stir crazy. And as luck would have it, as they were driving along the eastern bit of Ohio, it was raining, the pavement was wet, and they lost control of the car and crashed into a phone pole.
They realize that the car is beyond their ability to immediately repair it.
So he and Ricchetti do the only thing they can. They send their two girlfriends into the nearest town to try to find a mechanic or someone to come tow the car, and they go up and they sit on a hillside and wait.
Somebody came along and saw Floyd and Ricchetti and got suspicious.
They're wearing silk suits, and they just don't look like they belong. They notify the local authorities and say, hey, there's some pretty suspect characters here. You might want to investigate it. So the local sheriff comes along. Adam Ricchetti says he's the law, and he draws a gun, and the sheriff pulls a gun.
Floyd shoots, Ricchetti shoots, everybody misses. Ricchetti runs off. Sheriff Foltz has not a clue who these people are. All he knows is people are shooting at him. So he chases after Adam Ricchetti, presumably because he's the smaller and drunker of the two, and tackles him in the woods.
But Pretty Boy Floyd went on the run, and he ran for 3 days.
The feds are able to identify Adam Ricchetti, in large part because he says, my name is Adam Ricchetti. Not the sharpest guy you'll run into. And so word flashes among all the FBI offices in the state that the missing guy who's run off the wood may actually be Pretty Boy Floyd.
I get the phone call. Floyd's been spotted. Now's our chance.
Adam Ricchetti is now taken care of. Pretty Boy Floyd is now loose in the woods in eastern Ohio without a friend in sight. He has to get away.
So Melvin Purvis immediately charters a plane to Ohio, where a huge manhunt commences for Pretty Boy Floyd.
They bring together guys with bloodhounds on horseback in cars, and they spread all over that area for the next couple of days.
He's essentially escaping through the underbrush, the briar, the bramble of the forest there in Ohio. And of course, there's something like 200 men that are chasing him.
I always like being out in the woods. I like the feeling of running with wind in my hair. But I ain't sure I like being chased down by dogs, horses, and 200 lawmen. With John Dillinger dead and buried, and with Hoover burning to pin the Kansas City massacre on me, yours truly, Pretty Boy Floyd, becomes public enemy #1, which means Hoover and 200 lawmen are waiting to hunt me down like a dog in the Ohio woods.
Pretty Boy Floyd knew how to live off the land, and he knew how to hide, and he knew how you could make your way.
At 3 o'clock, he stumbles onto the farm of Ellen Conkle.
He's clearly had sun exposure. He's been sleeping in the thimbles and brambles.
And he's desperate for meat. He's begging for a piece of meat.
After 3 days in the woods, Ellen sure is a sight for sore eyes and an empty belly.
And in those days, someone like him would not be refused. So she gives him a meal. She fixes spare ribs, potatoes, sweet potatoes, pumpkin pie, and some coffee.
And he declares it the best meal he's ever eaten.
Floyd gives $1 to Mrs. Conkle, and then he asks the question, can somebody help me get into Youngstown today? She tells him, I'm not sure that we can help you, but my brother Stuart has a car. They begin to drive out into the nearby road. They spot 2 Chevrolets coming down the road.
I'm a lucky guy. I've had a lucky life. But sometimes, luck just takes a holiday.
Who should come around the bend but Melvin Purvis and a team of FBI agents and local sheriff's deputies? What happened when Purvis and Floyd came more or less face to face is another of those iconic Depression-era outlaw moments. The lawmen saw Floyd in the car. Floyd saw them. He got out and he ran behind a corn crib.
And the agents could see his feet going back and forth because the corn crib was raised off the ground.
The FBI men and the deputies all got out and pointed their guns and said, you know, we've got you surrounded, basically. Floyd could have surrendered very easily. Instead, he lit out across a cornfield.
I said I'm never going back to jail, and I meant it.
He keeps running, and there's a bank of trees that he's trying to make his way to because he feels like if he can get to that tree line, he can get into that forest and it'll be easier to hide.
And then my father said, open fire. And they did.
Chester Smith is a crack marksman, and from a distance of approximately 500 yards, Chester Smith fires off one shot, and he clips Pretty Boy's elbow.
He gets back up and he runs again for the hill. He zigs once and he's shot a second time. And that is the end of his running. The officers struggle up the hill to see what they can find out from this man.
My father walked up to Floyd after it was over and said, are you Pretty Boy Floyd? He said, I'm Charles Arthur Floyd.
And so Charles Arthur Floyd can barely breathe. He's down with 2 bullet wounds. He complains, you got me twice.
He said, tell us what happened in Kansas City. What do you know about Kansas City? What went down in Kansas City? And he said, I'm not telling you sons of bitches nothing.
And with that, he breathes his last at age 30.
8 months later, Adam Ricchetti stands trial for the Kansas City massacre.
He barely knew what was going on. It's the first time he'd been sober in probably 15 years. He was a pathetic creature.
The lawmen who survived the Kansas City massacre identify all 3 shooters in court.
I saw Vern Miller. He was there. I saw Adam Ricchetti. He was there. He's the one who shot me. I saw Pretty Boy Floyd. He was there. Remarkable how their memories had improved in that 2 or 3 years.
Adam Ricchetti, he never said anything about it. He never shed any light on it. As a matter of fact, as he was being escorted to the gas chamber, he was kicking and screaming, saying, why is this happening? I didn't do anything. Why are you doing this to me? He protested his innocence all the way through.
As he lay dying, Floyd refused to tell me what happened in Kansas City. But his autopsy was more revealing. Supposedly, he'd caught a bullet outside Union Station. The autopsy revealed nothing of the kind.
He said he had been shot in the right shoulder, and he didn't have any wound like that in the right shoulder.
You go through one pillar after the other, and what you find is that the Bureau's case just simply falls apart.
Floyd's burial took place in Aikens, Oklahoma. And we were all too happy to show off the body to whoever wanted to see it. That's what you do with trophies. You put them on display.
What's ironic about Pretty Boy Floyd and his attraction to Kansas City is that he had to come through Kansas City yet one more time, and that was in a pine box. Reportedly, somewhere between 20 and 30,000 people turned out for this funeral, just to get a glimpse, just to be part of it. It was written that it was the largest funeral ever in Oklahoma history.
For us at the Bureau, Floyd and the massacre at Kansas City was a decisive moment.
It was the Kansas City Massacre that started J. Edgar Hoover becoming a national figure. And it was the Kansas City Massacre that started the FBI on the road to becoming what it became.
J. Edgar Hoover wanted to be the point person when it came to taking the credit for all of this. There was probably some resentment by J. Edgar Hoover against Melvin Purvis. And I think that's borne out because Melvin Purvis really later on in years did not have a long career with the FBI.
Despite all that, I was hailed as a hero. And in some quarters, so was Pretty Boy Floyd.
What he accomplished as a criminal, it stands up to whatever John Dillinger did and other bank robbers of the era. So I would have to say that he was in the top tier of bank robbers of his era.
Floyd will be remembered fondly by his fans, but not by me. In the end, whatever the truth about the Kansas City Massacre, Pretty Boy got what he deserved.